Okay, so let's unpack this.
Right?
We're doing a deep dive today into something, well, something absolutely central.
To how societies work.
Yeah.
Definitely. How decisions get made.
Yeah, and even just, why the world is the way it is.
Fundamentally.
We are talking about power.
It's arguably the core concept in political thinking, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And to help us and you get a handle on it, we've got some really insightful material.
Yeah, specifically excerpts from An Introduction to Political Theory by O.P. Gaba.
Which does a great job, I think, of kind of dissecting the different angles on power. It's not just one thing.
Not at all.
Yeah.
So our mission really is to help you navigate this material.
Kind of a shortcut to getting well informed on this fundamental idea.
Exactly. Pull out the key insights, look at the different viewpoints, maybe contrast them a bit,
And hopefully spark a few of those aha moments for you about what power really means.
and how it shapes, well, pretty much everything.
Right. So the plan is, first, understand why it's such a big deal in political science. What's the significance?
Then we need to try and define it, which sounds simple, but
It isn't, especially going beyond just force.
which leads us straight into that really crucial relationship. Power, authority, and legitimacy.
The willing obedience idea.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And from there, we'll broaden out, look at the different forms power takes.
So political, obviously, but also economic and ideological.
Uh-huh. And then we'll get into the structure.
Yeah.
How is power actually arranged in society?
Which means looking at those different perspectives the source outlines.
The class view, the elitist view.
The gender perspective and the pluralist one. Lots to cover there.
And finally, we'll kind of flip the script.
Look at a different way of thinking.
Yeah, moving from power over others to this idea of a power to achieve things. A more constructive view.
Okay, sounds like a journey. Let's dive in.
Let's do it.
So, significance first. The material jumps right in, comparing power and political science to money and economics. That's a big claim.
It is a bold comparison, isn't it? But it highlights how central it is. Something that's, sought after, fought over, shapes all the relationships.
So why was focusing on power so important for the study of politics itself? The source says it was transformative.
Well, before that focus, political study could feel a bit scattered. Maybe just tacked onto philosophy or history or law.
Right, describing past events or ideal states or legal rules.
Exactly. But focusing on power gave political science its own distinct engine, its core subject.
It carved out its own space.
Yeah, and it let thinkers look behind the formal stuff, the constitutions, the parliaments,
To see what was really going on.
to ask about the real motives, the objectives, the forces driving political action and shaping those very institutions. It's about the why underneath the what.
Okay, so it's about understanding the real influence, not just the official flow chart.
Precisely. The source quotes Frederick Watkins back in the 30s.
Saying the scope isn't just the state.
But all associations where you see the problem of power, that's huge.
All associations, so companies, unions, families even.
Wherever there's influence in decision-making, power is likely there. And William Robson, another scholar, mentioned,
He said political science is primarily concerned with power.
its nature, basis, processes, scope, results, the whole package.
And the focus is on the struggle. Gaining it, keeping it, using it, resisting it.
That really captures the dynamic feel of politics, doesn't it? It's not static.
And the material points out this isn't new. Thinkers like Machiavelli, Hobbes,
Nietzsche, too. They all wrestled with this, even if they didn't use the exact same terms.
and modern writers really cemented it. Max Weber, Lasswell, Kaplan.
Yeah, Lasswell and Kaplan famously defined political science as simply the study of the shaping and sharing of power.
Shaping and sharing implies it's fluid, contested.
Definitely. And Weber saw politics itself as the struggle for power or the influencing of those in power. Between states, within states, it's everywhere.
There's another definition in there from Michael Curtis. Politics as organized dispute about power and its use.
And he unpacked that, saying the study involves looking at how power is won, used, controlled, the purpose behind it.
How decisions get made, what influences them, the whole context.
So you put all that together and you see why it's not just a topic. It's the lens, the driving force, the prize, the structure.
Okay. Point taken. Power is central. But what is it? If it's so important, we need a definition. Seems simple, but maybe not.
It's definitely tricky. The word gets used so broadly. The source starts with Bertrand Russell's definition.
The production of intended effects.
Yeah.
Very broad.
Yeah, like the power to make something happen, achieve your goal. Could be anything.
Power over nature, power over yourself.
Exactly. But for political science, theorists like Russell and Robert Dahl mentioned in the source tend to narrow it down.
To power over human beings,
Right.
the ability to influence other people. And when the source digs into that, a lot of the initial definitions focus on, well, overcoming resistance.
Yeah, Dahl's definition sounds pretty forceful. Getting compliance by threatening severe sanctions
Yeah.
makes you do it because you're afraid not to.
Definitely sounds like coercion. H.G. Wiseman's is similar, getting one's wishes carried out despite opposition.
And Stephen Wasby,
Yeah.
making someone do something against the will or desire of another.
So these early definitions really emphasize making people do things they don't want to do, power as forcing the unwilling.
And that's a key limitation the source points out. If power only worked that way.
It would be exhausting and probably wouldn't last long.
Exactly. Imagine constantly threatening everyone. Society would grind to a halt.
So effective, stable power needs something else.
It needs to become authority. And the key ingredient for authority is legitimacy.
Legitimacy. The magic ingredient that makes people obey willingly.
Or at least accept the decision as valid, even if they don't personally love it. Legitimacy means people see the rule or the ruler as somehow right, or necessary, or beneficial.
Beneficial for society, maybe for themselves too.
Ideally, yes. That belief in its rightness generates willing compliance. You follow the law, not just because you fear punishment, but because you accept the law's authority.
So force, sanctions, those are backup options for when legitimacy fails.
That's how the source presents it. Authority built on legitimacy is what ensures broad social acceptance and makes the system work smoothly.
This changes the picture quite a bit. Power isn't just brute force.
No, it's often about cultivating acceptance. McCalver's definition is interesting. Power is the capacity to command compliance, but the stability comes when people see it as right.
That's where that analogy comes in, the naked sword versus the sword in its scabbard.
Great analogy. Power alone is the naked threat. Authority is the sheathed sword. The power is there, but it's respected, legitimate, and doesn't need constant brute force.
Power relies on fear. Legitimacy relies on respect.
And authority blends the two, securing willing obedience most of the time. That's why it's seen as the most effective political tool.
Okay, so authority, power, plus legitimacy. That's the formula.
That's the core relationship. And if we're talking about authority, we have to talk about Max Weber.
His analysis of the types of authority is classic, foundational stuff.
Absolutely. The source lays out his three main types, though he knew they often blend in reality.
First up, traditional authority.
This is power legitimized by long-standing customs and traditions. It's always been done this way.
Like hereditary rulers, kings, queens, tribal elders.
Exactly. You obey the office, or the person holding it, because of established tradition and history. Legitimacy comes from the past.
Then there's charismatic authority. Very different feel.
Totally different. This rests entirely on the leader's personal qualities. Exceptional heroism, sanctity, or just that magnetic personality, the charisma.
People follow because they believe in that specific person. The source mentions Hitler as an example here.
It's a powerful example of how compelling and potentially dangerous this purely personal authority can be. It inspires intense devotion.
But it's inherently unstable, right? What happens when the charismatic leader is gone?
That's the problem, the succession crisis. Which leads to the third type, the one Weber saw as dominant in the modern world. Legal rational authority.
This is the power of the office, not the person, based on rules.
Precisely. Authority derived from a system of established laws and procedures. Think bureaucracy, elected office, appointed positions based on merit.
You obey the police officer or the judge because of the legal office they hold, filled according to rules, not because of who they are personally or who their ancestors were.
The authority resides in the rationally created office. This is the hallmark of modern states and bureaucracies with their complex systems of rules.
And the source notes, this is the main type in modern states, even if leaders also use charisma or benefit from tradition.
Weber's framework is super useful for dissecting why people obey in different contexts. It helps us understand the basis of legitimate rule.
Okay, so we have a better handle on power, authority, legitimacy, and Weber's types. Now, the source broadens the view again, looking at different forms of power in society.
Yeah, it stresses that political power doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's heavily supported, maybe even dependent on, economic and ideological power.
They prop each other up.
They're intertwined. Let's take political power first. We've touched on the state, but there's more.
Alan Ball's definition is mentioned power as key to resolving conflict. its distribution determining how conflicts get resolved.
And the source distinguishes the formal organs.
Legislature, executive, judiciary, the official state machinery.
Right. They make laws, implement policies, allocate resources, tax people, regulate activities, use police, courts, military, all backed by sanctions within a territory. That's the obvious bit.
But then there are the informal organs. Just as important, maybe more so sometimes.
Definitely influential. Political parties, pressure groups, public opinion, social movements.
And these aren't separate. They feed into the formal system, right? The source talks about inputs from the environment.
Absolutely. Formal institutions have to respond. Think about elections in democracies. Parties need public support.
Pressure groups lobby constantly.
Popular movements can force major changes, like civil rights or independence movements mentioned in the text. Even internationally, groups of nations influence powerful states.
So political power is this whole ecosystem of formal institutions and informal pressures constantly interacting.
Which naturally connects to economic power. The source calls this a really potent political factor.
Power based on wealth and, crucially, control over the means of production.
Exactly. Owning the land, the factories, the capital, the distribution networks, that gives you immense leverage.
How does that translate into political clout?
Well, the source gives examples. Wealthy individuals and corporations influencing government priorities, like that example about choosing color TVs over rural drinking water in India.
A stark illustration. And how do they exert this influence?
Through several channels. Organized pressure groups, for one. Business lobbies are often much better funded and organized than, say, consumer groups or labor unions.
Media ownership, too. Controlling newspapers, TV stations. That shapes the public conversation in your favor.
A huge factor. And then there's the direct funding of political campaigns and parties.
Often behind the scenes, creating that dual game the source mentions.
Right. Politicians might talk about helping the masses, but they know who funds their campaigns and expect access or favorable policies in return.
So economic power uses lobbying, media, and money to bend political power towards its interests.
That's the mechanism described. And then there's the third form, ideological power. This one's described as more subtle, but potentially very deep.
Power working through ideas, beliefs, values.
Yes, the ability to shape how people see the world, what they consider natural, right, or possible. It's about promoting a system of arguments and beliefs, an ideology that justifies the existing social order, or maybe a desired future one.
Its main function is providing legitimacy to the ruling class.
Exactly. If you can convince people that the system is fair or the best they can hope for, they're less likely to challenge it. It minimizes the need for outright force.
It manufactures consent, in a way.
That's a good way to put it. The source notes ideologies are action-oriented, giving people a cause, but can sometimes play on emotion rather than pure reason, elevating certain ideas to absolute truths.
This sounds like manipulative power.
The source uses that term, the power of the dominant class to shape thinking and feeling, creating an illusion of consent. People agree, but their agreement serves the interests of those in power.
That links back to Marx and Engels. The ideas of the ruling class are the ruling ideas. Control material production, control mental production.
They set the terms of the debate, define common sense. And this is where Antonio Gramsci's concept of hegemony becomes really central again.
Hegemony as that deeper cultural and ideological dominance.
Yes, Gramsci explained how capitalism maintains control not just through force or economics, but by achieving this sort of spiritual and cultural leadership, shaping values through institutions like schools, churches, media, what he called civil society.
So people internalize the dominant values and see the system as legitimate, even natural.
Which makes challenging it much harder. It explains why revolutions didn't happen as predicted in some Western countries. The ideological defenses were too strong.
Gramsci argued that any real change needed a cultural struggle too, not just an economic one.
Exactly. You had to challenge the hegemony, transform the values embedded in civil society.
These three forms, political, economic, ideological, they're clearly not separate boxes. They constantly interact and reinforce each other.
Absolutely. Which leads us to the next big question the source tackles. How is power actually structured in society? Who holds it?
And the source says modern analysis moves beyond just looking at the formal government structure, the Constitution.
Right. The traditional approach was just legislature, executive, judicial powers.
Yeah.
But that doesn't tell you who really calls the shots.
Especially if the Constitution promises equality, but real power lies elsewhere in economic structures or social hierarchies.
So the modern approach tries to identify the real centers and sources of power, often informal ones.
Which leads to the central question for this section. Can we identify specific groups that consistently hold power?
And the source presents four major theoretical perspectives, offering different answers. The class perspective, the elite perspective, the gender perspective, and the pluralist perspective. Each offers a different map of power.
Okay, let's unpack those. Starting with the class perspective Marxist theory.
Developed by Marx and Engels. The absolute core idea here is that political power grows out of economic power.
Owning the means of social production land, factories, capital, that's the foundation.
And society, historically, gets divided based on this ownership. You have the haves who own and control, and the have-nots who don't and are dependent.
Masters and slaves, lords and serfs.
And under capitalism, the bourgeoisie who own the capital and the proletariat who only own their labor power.
The power mechanism is exploitation. The owners force the workers to labor on their terms to generate profit and strengthen their own position.
Yes, and this inherent conflict of interest leads inevitably to class struggle. The dependent class resists, organizes, fights back. That famous line from the Communist Manifesto.
The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles.
Marx argued that capitalism, by concentrating workers together in factories and cities, actually makes it easier for the proletariat to organize and become conscious of their collective power.
Leading to the prediction of a socialist revolution, workers of all countries unite.
The idea was that the proletariat would overthrow the bourgeoisie, seize the means of production, and establish a socialist society.
Where production is socially owned and controlled, the source provides definitions for capitalism, bourgeoisie, proletariat, socialism based on this framework.
And the ultimate goal, in theory, is a communist society, classless.
And in a classless society, the argument goes, power as class domination wouldn't exist anymore.
Exactly. It's a framework that sees economic structure as the ultimate determinant of political power.
But we touched on Gramsci adding nuance to this. The source expands on his analysis of hegemony.
Right, Gramsci is crucial here. He looked at why capitalism was so resilient in the West, even with large working-class movements.
He felt the traditional Marxist focus on just economics or state coercion wasn't enough to explain it.
He argued the real strength lay in spiritual and cultural supremacy, achieved through civil society. Schools, churches, media, they instill bourgeois values.
This led him to refine the base superstructure idea. He saw the superstructure, especially civil society, as having gained a degree of autonomy in the West.
It wasn't just a reflection of the economic base, it was a power center in its own right.
He split the superstructure into political society, the state using coercion, and civil society using consent.
And he put special emphasis on civil society, the family, schools, churches, media, etc., as the key site for manufacturing consent and legitimacy.
They socialized people into accepting the ruling class's authority, making inequality seem normal or fair.
This is how hegemony is built. The ruling class seems to rule with the consent of the governed, because their worldview has become dominant.
So the state's force, police, prisons, is only needed when this consent breaks down.
Which meant, for Gramsci, that any revolutionary strategy had to target this cultural hegemony too. You couldn't just seize the state. You had to change the values in civil society.
An ideological battleground.
Exactly. He urged Marxists to engage in cultural struggle in art, education, philosophy, to build a new counter-hegemonic consciousness based on socialist values.
It's a much more complex view of power, extending beyond just economics and the state into culture and ideas.
Yes, certainly. Now, moving away from class, we have the elite perspective. This also sees a ruling minority, but for different reasons.
Developed by Pareto, Mosca, Michels. They agree there's a split between rulers and ruled.
But they see it as somewhat inevitable, maybe even natural, based on things like talent, organizational skill, or psychological traits, not just property ownership.
And they're generally less optimistic about ending this division.
Let's look at Pareto. He talked about the elite as the superior group with the highest ability. The masses just follow.
He had the governing elite in power and the non-governing elite trying to get in.
Leading to the circulation of elites. Power changes hands between elite groups, but the masses stay out. He also talked about lions and foxes, different elite types.
Mosca had a similar idea. A ruling minority is inevitable, primarily because they're organized while the majority is not.
He called it the political class. They control wealth and power and justify it with moral principles. Mosca perhaps saw a bit more potential for new leaders to rise from lower strata, but the basic minority rule remains.
So elite theory sees the division as maybe functional based on competence, unlike class theories focus on exploitation. Change is just elite circulation, not revolution.
And then Robert Michaels throws another spanner in the works with his iron law of oligarchy.
This sounds even more pessimistic.
It is. Based on studying large organizations like political parties, Michaels argued that any organization, no matter how democratic its aims, inevitably ends up being run by a small clique, an oligarchy.
Why? Because the leaders become indispensable?
Partly that, and partly the apathy of the masses. Leaders develop their own interests, use their skills to stay in power, and the organization becomes less democratic over time.
So Michel suggests even attempts at democracy or socialism will just lead to rule by a new elite. It seems to rule out even the circulation of elites benefiting the masses.
It's a powerful critique of democratic potential. The source notes its influence on Weber, who redefined democracy as just elite competition.
And Weber used it to argue socialism would just mean a dictatorship of officials.
Then there's C. Wright Mills's study of the American power elite.
Not just one elite group, but an interlocking network.
Yes, top figures from corporations, the military, and the political executive. Mills saw them as sharing backgrounds, values, and operating as a semi-unified force at the strategic command posts of society.
Capable of shaping events, not just responding to them.
Right. So the elite perspective offers various takes on minority rule based on talent, organization, or institutional position, contrasting sharply with the economic focus of class theory.
Okay, third perspective. The gender perspective, rooted in feminist theory.
This shifts the focus to another fundamental division: gender, society divided into dominant men and dependent women.
And crucially, this is seen as a social construct, not a biological destiny.
Exactly. Society created the power imbalance. Feminism seeks to dismantle it. The core concept here is patriarchy.
Rule by men. The source brings in Engels' historical account.
Arguing that the rise of private property and the desire to control inheritance led to the control of women's sexuality and their confinement to the domestic sphere, marking the world historic defeat of the female sex.
Establishing male rule through the patriarchal family.
And contemporary use extends beyond the family to describe the whole system of male domination in society, in social relations, reproduction, sexuality, violence, the workplace.
Modern theories point to different bases for this. Social structuring of gender, maybe biological differences historically, control of sexuality, male violence.
Or economic factors, like men benefiting from women's unpaid domestic labor, as Marxist feminists argue.
The source suggests these explanations complement each other, showing different aspects of patriarchal power.
And the economic consequences are stark, highlighted by those UN statistics about women's work versus income and property ownership.
This fueled the women's liberation movement, demanding fundamental change.
Not just legal equality, but challenging the deep-seated myths, values, and beliefs about women's roles across society in work, family, politics, culture, even language.
Leading to debates about things like childcare, sexism in media, representation.
And resulting in real changes, including new laws protecting women's rights, examples of which are given for India.
So the gender perspective reveals power operating through patriarchal structures intersecting with economic and cultural factors.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, the final perspective offered is the group perspective, associated with pluralist theory. This one offers a very different picture.
Unlike the others that see power concentrated, pluralism sees it as dispersed.
Yes, spread out among many different competing social groups, unions, business associations, farmers, consumers, ethnic groups, you name it.
And no single group dominates overall.
That's the core idea. Each group has influence in its own area, and they act as checks and balances on each other. Public policy emerges from the bargaining and compromise between them.
Like an equilibrium of competing interests.
It's presented as both a description of how some societies, like liberal democracies, work, and a justification for that system.
Power isn't concentrated, it's spread across multiple centers. The source mentions historical roots in medieval Europe.
With competing centers of loyalty like the monarchy, church, guilds. But modern pluralism sees groups as intermediaries between the individual and the state.
Influencing policy, representing members' interests. Tocqueville saw these groups as vital for American democracy.
Modern pluralists, like Robert Dahl, argued political resources are widely distributed, different groups win on different issues. Dahl's term polyarchy suggests rule by many competing groups, with government as a broker.
Polsby's quote, At bottom, nobody dominates.
But pluralism has faced strong criticism. One is that it only looks at decisions that get made, ignoring how powerful groups might keep certain issues off the agenda entirely. Non-decision making.
And groups themselves might not be democratic internally. Leaders might pursue their own interests.
Plus, Stephen Lutz's third dimension of power, the ability to shape people's very desires and perceptions so they don't even recognize their own true interests. Pluralism often misses this subtle power.
These critiques led later pluralists like Lindblom and Dahl to modify their views.
Acknowledging things like the privileged position of business or the need for policies to reduce power inequalities.
So while pluralism highlights group competition, we need to be aware of potential hidden power dynamics. The source has a useful table comparing all four perspectives.
Right. Now, after looking at all these ways power operates, often as power over, the source introduces a really important shift in perspective.
Towards power, too, a more positive or constructive idea.
Exactly. Instead of just focusing on dominance, it asks, what kind of power does the subject, the person being dominated, need? Not just power to resist, but power to achieve their own goals, to develop themselves.
It's about agency and capacity, not just control.
It's the difference between extractive power, using others, and power to achieving your own ends. The concept of empowerment fits right in here.
Equipping vulnerable groups with the ability to resist oppression and develop their potential.
And the source looks at three key thinkers who explored this: Hannah Arendt, C.B. Macpherson, and Mahatma Gandhi.
Arendt's distinction between power and violence is striking.
Very stark. For her, violence is an instrument used by rulers, held in possession. It can destroy power, but never create it.
So where does power come from?
From the people acting together, acting in concert. Power belongs to the group, exists only when people cooperate. It can't be owned or stored by an individual or the state.
Institutions are just manifestations of this collective power.
Yes. She contrasted the public realm, people acting freely, creating power through consensus, with the state, using violence, coercion, hierarchy. Power is in the public realm.
Her warning: where genuine power is absent, violence may emerge to fill the gap.
And she argued only genuine power, this collective action, can create legitimate authority. True freedom and happiness for her came from participating in this shared public power.
A very different vision of politics.
Then there's C.B. Macpherson with his extractive versus developmental power.
Extractive is power over, developmental is power to.
Essentially, developmental power is the ability to use your own human capacities, reason, morality, creativity, relationships for your own goals. Being a creator, not just a means to someone else's end.
What stops us from achieving this?
Macpherson pointed to lack of means of life, lack of access to means of labor, lack of protection. He felt these were inherent problems in capitalist market societies.
His solution involved moving beyond capitalism.
Yes, combining civil liberties with a socialist mode of production to allow everyone to fully realize their developmental power and achieve creative freedom.
And finally, Mahatma Gandhi, approaching power from the perspective of the ruled.
His focus was intensely on power to the people. Real self-government, or Swaraj, wasn't just replacing rulers.
But about the people gaining the capacity to resist authority when it is abused.
It's about educating the masses to regulate and control power themselves. The power of the ruled is a moral power to challenge, protest, exert pressure nonviolently.
Speaking truth to power.
Exactly. So Arendt, Macpherson, and Gandhi all point towards this other kind of power, collective, developmental, rooted in the people's capacity to act and resist, not just dominate.
It's a crucial shift from power as zero-sum control to power as a potential for liberation and growth.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, we've covered a lot of ground.
From why power is so central, through definitions, the link to authority and legitimacy,
Weber's types, the different forms, political, economic, ideological.
and then those major perspectives on structure, class, elite, gender, pluralist, each giving us a different piece of the puzzle.
And finally, contrasting that dominant power over idea with the crucial concept of power too.
It's clear that power isn't simple. It's layered, complex, works in different ways, and these theories help us see those different facets.
And understanding these isn't just academic. It gives you, the listener, tools to analyze the power dynamics you encounter every day.
In your workplace, your community, in politics, asking critical questions becomes easier.
Who holds influence? On what basis? How is it used? Who benefits? Who doesn't?
Hopefully, exploring this source material has given you a clearer map for navigating those questions.
We've seen power located in economic ownership, elite networks, Gender structures, group competition, collective action, individual capacity, it's everywhere.
So here's a final thought to take away from this deep dive. As you go about your day, try to consciously notice. Where do you see power over operating? In subtle ways, maybe, or obvious ones.
And maybe more importantly, where do you see potential for power too? How can that capacity for individuals and communities to act, to develop, to shape their own futures, how can that be nurtured and strengthened?
Something to think about as you continue your own exploration of how the world works.